Warning: this article discusses themes of suicide and may be confronting for some readers. When Lifeline volunteer Anne heads into a shift, she has no idea who she will be talking to that day, but she knows it will be important. It could be someone who is facing down one of their most harrowing moments, or maybe the person on the other end of the line is simply lonely, with no one they feel they can turn to. Calls to Lifeline are continuing to surge, with the Crisis Support and Suicide Prevention Service experiencing its 50 busiest ever days since August 2021, new figures show. Read more. Lifeline launches 24/7 text service as record numbers seek support. The most calls Lifeline has ever received on a single day was on New Year's Day this year, with 3,726 calls. But, on average, Lifeline now receives around 3,000 calls every day. Anne, who works in psychology, has been a Lifeline volunteer for the past 5 years after deciding she wanted to use her skills to give back to the community. She said the experience has exposed her to a whole new world, despite her professional training. It's a national call line, and literally anybody can ring, she told 9.com.Au. So it's a real eye-opener, I think, in that sense, of how many different people there are, everybody going through their own problems and having their own story. It's not all suicide-related calls. While people might imagine Lifeline operators are fielding calls non-stop relating to suicide, that's not necessarily the case, Anne said. Of course you do get those calls, and they're so important when you're being with a person in probably what is their darkest moments, but, at other times, it is for something that's not maybe as imminent in terms of suicide risk, but somebody's going through a crisis. I find them just as important, she said. If there is an opportunity to help somebody at that earliest stage, I would rather talk to them in that moment, than talk to them down the road where they've followed a path that's more difficult to get out of. One thing the calls to Lifeline show is that just because people are surrounded by others, it doesn't mean they aren't lonely, Anne said. You get people calling Lifeline who might have people around them but just don't know how to talk to them. Then there are people who really just don't have anybody around them at all, and they don't have anywhere else to go. You might hear a knock on the door. One of the challenges a Lifeline volunteer can have is not knowing the ending. Anyone who phones Lifeline is able to do so anonymously, which means volunteers usually don't find out what happens next. Most of the time you don't find out, and said. Sometimes, if it is a case where a web intervened, you might be there on the line until you hear a knock on the door from a policeman or such. Other times you might not. It doesn't have to be a suicide intervention. There could be somebody who you're concerned about. You leave off with an encouraging kind of feel to the call, but you still don't know what's going to happen to them. You might never speak to them again. Lifeline volunteers are given good training and support, however, in learning how to not carry the burden themselves, Anne said. Anne said she also takes comfort in knowing she has done her best to help in that instance, and if the person needs help in future they may call back. Even if they don't ring you back specifically, because the call goes to whoever, the volunteer they're connected with is still going to be somebody who's well trained and who cares, she said. The connection goes both ways. While she might be talking to a complete stranger, and said she can usually get a sense of if she has been able to help someone. I think you can tell, because I think the connection goes both ways, she said. You know when you've been able to reach someone because, in some sense, they've been able to reach you too. The training is stellar. While people considering volunteering for Lifeline might be fearful of being thrown in the deep end, this was definitely not the case, Anne said. I think the training at Lifeline is really stellar. Maybe that is a fear people have going in. What do? Do you just get thrown on the phones? The answer is no. You really go through quite a detailed and rigorous program where you learn the knowledge, and practice scenarios. Lifeline volunteers are trained in the different issues callers might have and how to respond to them. They start by listening on the phones and then taking calls with someone nearby for support, Anne says. Name has been changed. Help from Lifeline can be reached on 13 11 14 or at lifeline.org.au. As part of World Suicide Prevention Day on September 10th, Lifeline is launching a new campaign, Out of the Shadows, which is aimed at reducing the self-stigma amongst those who experience mental ill health as well as public stigma by changing attitudes and behaviors in the general community.